The train slid into the station just before midnight, its brakes shrieking against the rails, the sound ricocheting under the enormous arch of steel and glass. The motion slowed until the carriages sighed into stillness, their windows glowing faintly against the black night. When the doors opened, a sharp rush of cold air swept through, carrying with it the smell of iron, coal, and faintly of bread, from some unseen bakery still working through the night. I stepped down onto the platform, suitcase trailing behind me, and at once I felt the weight of the place. The ground beneath my feet was colder, harder than the soft cobblestones of Rome or Paris, as though the stone had absorbed every hurried step, every reunion, every farewell spoken in this hall for generations. The station was alive despite the hour. Announcements crackled overhead in clipped German, their rhythm brisk and commanding, bouncing through the vaulted arches with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. A bell clanged sharply, followed by the arrival of another train, its steel body shrieking as it braked, sparks flying like brief stars. Carriages slid past me, their windows lantern-like, glowing faces inside blurred by reflection, some pressed against the glass with fatigue, others alert and eager. All of them carried forward by the same endless current of motion. I tilted my head back to take in the roof above, a cathedral not of stone, but of steel and glass. Iron ribs arched high, crossing and curving, supporting a ceiling that seemed to stretch as far as the sky itself. Between the panes of glass, I caught faint traces of stars, trembling above the haze of light. The lamps hung low enough to blind, glowing orbs suspended in the dark, their beams casting long shadows across the platform. My own footsteps echoed hollowly as I walked, reverberating as though I was not alone, even when I paused. The Alps had been silent, silence that demanded reverence, silence that filled me with its immensity. Here, the sound was different. It was not noise for the sake of noise. It was echo, repetition, the layering of countless arrivals and departures until the air itself felt saturated with memory. This station had seen soldiers leave and never return. Lovers reunite after years apart. Children stumble sleepily through its halls. Merchants carry goods across borders. Travelers like me caught only in transit. Every step, every whistle, every announcement had sunk into the stone, and I felt it under my shoes, history humming, restless and alive. Around me, life continued in fragments. A soldier in uniform wrapped his arms around a woman in a red scarf, their embrace so fierce it seemed they were trying to hold time itself still. A mother tugged her daughter by the hand, the little girl's stuffed rabbit dragging across the ground, its ears gray from dust, her eyes glassy with exhaustion. A group of students laughed too loudly, their backpacks bouncing, their energy sharp and defiant against the late hour. A man leaned against a pillar with his suitcase at his feet, staring at the clock that hung heavy above us, its black hands ticking solemnly toward 12. I lowered my own suitcase beside a bench and sat, watching it all. Midnight in a station is unlike midnight anywhere else. It is neither beginning nor end, neither safety nor danger. It is a threshold, a place where time bends, where lives touch only briefly before sliding away. The platform breathed with motion, trains arriving and departing with relentless rhythm. Whistles blew, doors slammed, footsteps hurried, voices called names I didn't recognize. And still above it all, the roof held steady, collecting every sound, throwing it back in echo, making me feel both smaller and strangely eternal. The clock struck 12 with a slow, deliberate chime. Its sound rolled through the hall, deeper than the whistles, steadier than the footsteps. I felt suspended, caught in a moment outside of ordinary time. Around me, life did not pause. Trains still moved, people still hurried, children still yawned, but I felt the weight of it press into me. Stations at midnight do not belong to the people who pass through them. They belong to everyone, and no one. They are eternal, holding stories for only a breath before letting them go. I thought then that this was why I traveled. Not for monuments or museums, not for checklists or photographs, but for this, for the communion of strangers, for the fleeting contact of eyes meeting across a platform, for the knowledge that my story brushed against theirs, even if only for a heartbeat. These moments were small and unrecorded, but they mattered. They mattered because they reminded me that the world is larger than my own steps, yet still connected by the simplest of things: movement, waiting, departure. A whistle blew again, shrill and final, and a train slid away into the dark, its tail lights glowing red like fading numbers. Almost immediately another took its place, roaring into the hall. New faces pressed against glass, new stories spilling onto the platform. It was relentless, this rhythm, and yet it comforted me. It told me I was not lost, only passing through. As I rose to collect my suitcase, I thought of where the rails might carry me next. Eastward, perhaps. Toward Poland. Toward Krakow, whose squares I imagined alive even at night, lanterns glowing against centuries-old stone, music weaving through narrow streets. The idea tugged at me, insistent, as though the next chapter had already begun to whisper from beyond the horizon. The train pressed deeper into the mountains, and with every mile, the world outside grew wilder, sharper, more untamed. Valleys opened and closed like pages in a vast book, rivers flashing silver between the folds, bridges arching so high above the torrents below that I held my breath each time we crossed. The light shifted constantly. Sometimes a clear gold that spilled across snow and stone, sometimes veiled by clouds that draped the peaks in gray shawls. No scene lasted for long. Each curve of the tracks revealed another world, and I couldn't look away. Inside the carriage, life unfolded with a strange mixture of routine and awe. A man across the aisle read his newspaper with the deliberate patience of someone who had made this journey many times. He folded each page with precision, as if order itself mattered more than the words. A young couple sat at the end of the row, their heads leaning together, whispering with the intimacy of people who believed the world existed only for them. Their laughter was soft, bubbling out occasionally, warming the air more than the heater humming beneath our feet. Behind me, a child tapped rhythmically on the armrest until his mother hushed him with the gentle "basta amore," spoken so tenderly it felt more like a caress than a scolding. I carried a cup of coffee from the dining car back to my seat. It rattled against its saucer with every sway of the train. The aroma filled the cabin, mingling with the faint scent of polished wood and old upholstery. There was something timeless about it, as though hundreds of travelers before me had sat in the same spot, holding the same cup, marveling at the same peaks. Soldiers on leave, lovers eloping, families fleeing or returning, dreamers chasing new lives. The Alps had carried them all, their silence preserving stories that would never be written. At one point, the train slowed and crept along a ridge so narrow it felt suspended in air. The valley beneath was so vast, it seemed to swallow the sky itself. Far below, a lake spread wide and still. Its surface so perfect it mirrored the peaks above in flawless reflection. I pressed my palm against the cold window, a futile gesture, as if I could bridge the distance with my skin. My own reflection hovered in the glass, pale and ghost-like, my eyes wide with awe. The man with the newspaper glanced at me, noticed my stare. He tapped the glass and spoke a single word in German. Schön. Beautiful. His voice was low but certain, a verdict no one could dispute. I nodded, smiling, and in that moment we were not strangers, but companions in wonder.
A symbol word had made us kin, however briefly. The train plunged into a tunnel and the world disappeared. Darkness pressed against the windows, the wheels roared inside the hollow belly of stone, and every sound reverberated like a drum beat. For a moment, I closed my eyes, letting the vibrations shake through me, imagining what lay above, tons of rock, snow, forests. It was humbling to think how small we were, a thin silver thread moving through the bones of the earth. When the light returned, it was blinding. The train burst into a world remade. A glacier gleamed ahead, pale and endless, the sun scattering across its surface in fractured blue light. It looked like glass, like frozen sky, too delicate to belong to stone, yet impossibly enduring. I gasped without meaning to, the sound joining the chorus of others who leaned closer to their windows at the same moment. Beauty like this didn't belong to one pair of eyes. It demanded to be shared. We climbed higher still, crossing bridges where waterfalls leapt from cliffs in silver ribbons, dissolving into mist before touching ground. Wooden chalets clung to slopes, their shutters painted bright green or red, smoke curling from chimneys despite the remoteness. I thought of the lives lived in those houses, children growing up with the sound of bell cows and avalanches, families who measured their days by the shifting snow instead of hours on a clock. The child behind me had grown restless again. His small voice suddenly broke the hush. Berga! Mountains! The word came out like a prayer. His mother smiled, smoothed his hair, and didn't correct him. No correction was needed. It was the only word that fit. The train curved, carrying us onwards, and I felt the rhythm settle into my chest, like a second heartbeat. Rome had been fire. Paris a sigh. The Alps, so far, had been silence. But here, moving steadily toward the north, I sensed another rhythm waiting beyond the mountains. Germany. Stations humming with footsteps at midnight, platforms where voices echoed into iron arches, places where solitude took on a new shape. The Alps were the breath before, but I knew my next chapter would begin in the echo.
The train carried us onward, deeper into the veins of the mountains, and I felt as if time itself had slowed to the pace of the wheels. Every turn of the tracks revealed another valley, another cliff, another sweep of light and shadow. Some valleys were so narrow that the peaks seemed to lean inward, closing above us like a book, while others opened into wide basins where rivers shimmered like spilled silver beneath the pale sun. We passed through tunnel after tunnel, each one swallowing us in darkness before releasing us into a new vision. The transitions became their own rhythm: roar, silence, light, shadow, until I no longer knew how many we had crossed. In each stretch of dark, I closed my eyes, listening to the echo of the train pounding through stone, and felt myself surrendering to something larger. The Alps were teaching me what it meant to let go, to allow beauty to arrive without clutching at it, to let awe exist without naming it. Inside the carriage, the atmosphere had shifted. The chatter that had filled the morning was gone, replaced by a shared hush. Even the young couple, so eager with their whispers earlier, sat quietly now, their fingers still linked, but their gazes turned outward. The man with the newspaper had set it aside entirely, forgotten. The child who had shouted, "Berge!" leaned heavily against his mother, his breath fogging the glass as he drifted into half-sleep, eyelids fluttering but unwilling to miss too much. It seemed as though the mountains had reached inside the train and wrapped us all in their silence. I pressed my forehead against the window. The glass was cool, grounding, and my reflection wavered against the backdrop of cliffs that looked as if they had stood since the beginning of time. The peaks rose higher now, streaked with snow, their edges so jagged they looked almost unreal, as though painted with deliberate strokes. Waterfalls spilled from impossible heights, vanishing into mist long before they reached the valley floors. For a moment, I thought of Rome's fountains, crafted, human, meant to dazzle. Here, nature created fountains that dwarfed any man-made beauty, fountains that no one had built and no one could stop. A strange clarity seeped into me then. I thought of the burdens I had been carrying, questions about my life at home, the pressure of choices I hadn't yet made, the lingering ache of old disappointments. Each tunnel seemed to take one of those worries and bury it in the mountain, leaving me lighter when we emerged again. It wasn't released by force, but by quiet surrender. The Alps didn't demand. They simply showed me their magnitude, and in their presence, my own troubles shrank into proportion. I scribbled a single word in my notebook: emptying. It felt true, not empty in the sense of loss, but in the sense of being cleared, prepared for something new. Travel had always been about adding new sights, new experiences, new people, but here it was about subtraction, about stripping away the noise until only stillness remained. The train curved sharply, wheels screeching as it followed the line of a cliff. Below, I saw another valley where a cluster of chalets huddled together, smoke rising thin and fragile into the sky. I imagined the lives within, simple routines against impossible backdrops. Tending cows, baking bread, listening to the same whistle of passing trains day after day. Their lives were rooted in this enormity, and somehow that grounded me too. As the sun tilted toward afternoon, the peaks began to glow with that pale, ethereal light that made them seem less like stone and more like something holy. My chest loosened, my breath steadied, and I realized I was smiling without knowing it. For the first time in weeks, I felt no urgency, no need to write, to rush, to capture. It was enough to sit, to breathe, to let the mountains pour through me. The Alps were not a destination. They were a passage, a threshold between one life and another. And as the train pushed further into their heart, I understood that some passages were more important than any arrival. By late afternoon, the sun had begun to sink, and the mountains changed again. What had been fierce and blinding in the noonday light softened into long shadows in quiet fire. The snow on the highest peaks glowed pale rose, then deepened into gold, then finally into a muted violet, as if the Alps were painting their own farewell to the day. I leaned closer to the window, unwilling to let my eyes stray for even a second. Every turn of the train felt like a curtain pulled back, revealing a new stage of beauty, and I wanted to hold each one until the last. The carriage seemed to sense the shift too. Passengers stirred but did not speak. Even the young couple, so alive with whispers in the morning, sat in silence, watching the light change. The man with the newspaper had abandoned it completely, resting his chin in his hand as he gazed out. The child, too, had gone quiet, his wide eyes drinking in the sight of the peaks as if they were a story told only once in a lifetime. It was as if the mountains themselves had pressed their stillness into us, commanding attention with nothing but presence. We crossed another viaduct, the valley yawning open beneath. The river below had caught the last of the light and turned into a ribbon of molten gold, winding endlessly through the darkening forest. Houses clustered along its banks, their windows glowing warmly now, like fragile lanterns clinging to the earth. I thought of the families inside, cooking meals, setting tables, lighting candles. How strange that their ordinary lives existed against a backdrop so extraordinary. And yet perhaps that was the lesson, that magnificence doesn't erase the simple, it magnifies it. The train slipped into a long tunnel, and for a while everything was dark. The roar of the wheels echoed like a heartbeat inside the mountain. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of stone pressing down, timeless, indifferent. When we burst out again, dusk had deepened. The peaks were now only silhouettes, black cutouts against the fading violet of the sky. Stars had begun to appear, scattered and trembling, fragile above the immensity of rock. Lamps flickered on in the carriage, casting soft golden halos across the seats. The warmth inside contrasted with the growing chill beyond the glass, and for a moment it felt as if the train itself was a floating hearth, carrying its passengers safely through the vast night. I folded my hands in my lap, realizing how light they felt, how free my chest was. The Alps had taken much from me, the weight of restlessness, the ache of questions without answers, and had returned something else. Clarity, the kind that doesn't shout but whispers steadily in your bones. As darkness spread fully, I thought ahead, beyond the mountains. Germany waited on the other side. Stations alive with footsteps at midnight, the echo of voices under iron arches, the pulse of a country in motion. The Alps had been my pause, but the journey was not finished. Another rhythm awaited me, one I could already sense in the rails, carrying us forward. I opened my notebook and wrote one line, letting the pen linger. The silence of mountains prepares you for the echo of cities. The words felt true, even if they were not enough. Then I closed the book, letting the sound of the wheels finish the thought. Outside, the last traces of sunlight surrendered to night, and the Alps faded into shadow. I whispered a quiet thank you into the class, unsure if it was for the peaks, for the journey, or for myself. Maybe for all of it. And then, as the train pressed forward, I felt it, the pull of what lay beyond. Krakow, its squares alive even at night, lanterns glowing against ancient stone, voices rising into the dark. The thought stirred inside me insistent, as though the next chapter was already calling. Night descended fully, and with it the Alps disappeared into shadow. Where in daylight they had stood sharp and unyielding, now they dissolved into the dark. Their presence felt rather than seen. The window showed only fragments, a faint reflection of my own face, the glow of lamps strung along distant valleys, the occasional flash of a river catching the last scraps of moonlight. The train pressed on, its wheels steady, its rhythm hypnotic, like a lullaby sung in iron. Inside the carriage, the lamps glowed warmly, creating small islands of light in the long corridor. People had settled into the rituals of night. The young couple drew a blanket over their laps, their laughter softened into whispers too low to catch. The man with the newspaper had surrendered entirely, his head bowed, mouth slightly open in sleep. The child behind me leaned against his mother's shoulder, clutching his stuffed rabbit tightly, his eyes heavy but still half open, as though even in dreams he didn't want to miss the ride. I stayed awake. Something about this night felt too precious to close my eyes against. There was a safety here, a cocooning comfort in the gentle sway of the train, and yet there was also a loneliness that tugged at me. Midnight had a way of stripping away pretense. Without the distraction of daylight or the hum of conversation, all that remained were thoughts and the steady voice of the rails. I opened my notebook and let the pen hover above the page, but words didn't come. What could I write that wouldn't feel small compared to what I had lived today? The Alps weren't a story to capture. They were an experience to be carried. So instead I sketched rough outlines of peaks, the sweep of valleys, a lone lamp on a station platform we had passed earlier, snow falling in its glow. The lines were clumsy, my hand untrained, but somehow they felt more honest than words. The train slowed briefly at a tiny station. I pressed my forehead against the glass, peering out at the solitary platform. A single lamp burned overhead, snow drifting lazily around it. No one waited, no one boarded. For a heartbeat, the scene looked eternal, a frozen painting of stillness caught between departures. Then the whistle blew, the wheels clanked back into rhythm, and the station slipped away into darkness. I leaned back, letting the motion cradle me. My thoughts wandered, back to Rome's fire, to Paris's whispers, to the silence of the Alps that had stripped me of old weights. And forward, too, to what waited ahead. Germany. Stations at midnight, platforms alive with footsteps, voices echoing beneath vast iron arches. It felt close now, humming beneath the surface of the night, ready to break into my journey. The child behind me murmured in his sleep a single word, Bergi, mountains, and I smiled, knowing he would carry this night with him too, though perhaps he wouldn't remember it clearly. That was the gift of travel. Even what you forget still shapes you. The train pressed on, and for the first time, my eyelids grew heavy. I closed my notebook, tucked it into my bag, and let myself drift into half-dreams stitched from everything I had seen. Snow and fountains, laughter and silence, mountains and rails. The rhythm of the journey held me, steady, unrelenting, kind. And as sleep pulled me under, I felt not loss, but readiness, as if the night itself was a passage carrying me toward whatever waited beyond the mountains. The deeper into the night we traveled, the more the train felt like its own world, cut loose from time. The Alps outside had dissolved completely into darkness, their jagged edges softened into a single vast shadow. Only the occasional glimmer betrayed them, a string of village lights clinging to a slope, or the silver shimmer of a river bending under the moon. The rest was nothingness, vast and unyielding. And yet, inside the carriage, there was warmth. The lamps cast their soft halos across the narrow corridor, painting the edges of coats, scarves, and tired faces in gold. The air smelled faintly of coffee long finished, mingled with the clean sharpness of snow carried in on passengers' boots. The rhythm of the train was the same as always, steel against steel, a steady chant. But at night it grew louder, more insistent, as if the rails themselves wanted to remind us of their power. Most passengers had fallen into sleep. The couple at the end of the row curled together, their blankets sliding to the floor, their faces peaceful, almost childlike. The man with the newspaper stirred occasionally, adjusting his position but never waking fully. The child behind me had finally surrendered, rabbit pressed tightly against his chest, his small breaths fogging the window each time the train leaned into a curve. Even their silence was a kind of companionship. I alone remained awake, unwilling to let the night slip by unnoticed. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, superimposed on faint shapes of peaks and rivers. It looked different somehow, older perhaps, or simply changed. Journeys have a way of showing you faces you didn't know you carried. The train slowed once more, hissing as it pulled into another small station. I leaned closer, forehead against the cold pane to see the platform. A single lamp burned above, its light cutting through the snow that swirled lazily downward. The benches were empty, the timetable unmoving. Yet the lamp glowed steadily, as if keeping vigil for a traveler who might never arrive. Something about the sight caught in my chest. Even in the heart of nowhere, there was readiness, a promise that someone could still come, that movement never ceased. When we started again, I let the rhythm carry me deeper into thought. The Alps had stripped me bare with their silence, their enormity. Tonight, the train seemed to whisper that it was nearly time to return to noise, to stations alive with footsteps, to voices echoing against iron arches, to the pulse of cities where midnight did not mean stillness, but motion. I could almost hear it already, as if Germany were humming just beyond the darkness, preparing to draw me in. The more I thought of it, the more I realized that travel was not simply about destinations, It was about thresholds, these in-between places where you are no longer who you were, but not yet who you will be. Rome had filled me with fire. Paris had taught me to linger. The Alps had emptied me of weight. And now, in this night, I was waiting, suspended between mountains and stations, between silence and echo. The train rattled through another tunnel, the sound swelling until it filled the carriage entirely, pressing into my chest like a second heartbeat. When we emerged, I saw the faint glow of a larger town in the distance. Streets lit by amber lamps, rows of houses, a station roof gleaming faintly under the moon. The sight tugged at me, a reminder that the pause of the Alps was ending, that the world of human rhythm was returning. I closed my notebook, resting my hand on its cover instead of writing. There were no words large enough for what I carried. Perhaps there didn't need to be. Sometimes, silence is the truest record. I leaned back, finally allowing my eyelids to lower. The train hummed and rocked, steady and certain, pulling me toward the edge of the mountains and into whatever waited beyond. The last thought that floated through me before sleep was this: the Alps had been the breath, but Germany would be the echo. Dawn crept into the carriage like a shy guest, hesitant at first, then bolder with each passing minute. The blackness that had hidden the world outside began to loosen, giving way to a soft gray, then pale streaks of lavender and rose. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, leaned into the window, and gasped. The Alps were still there, vast, ancient, eternal, but they looked different in the morning light. Their sharp edges were softened, their crowns of snow glowing faintly, as if lit from within. The mountains that had towered over me with stern majesty in the afternoon now seemed gentler, like guardians seeing me safely off at the border of their kingdom. The carriage stirred slowly, as if waking with the land itself. The young couple shifted under their blanket, stretching and yawning before dissolving into soft laughter, their faces flushed with the warmth of sleep. The man with the newspaper straightened his jacket and smoothed his hair, blinking against the light as though reluctant to surrender to the day. Even the child behind me stirred, Rabbit still clutched tightly, his small face pressed to the glass, flogging it anew as he whispered, "Burge," in a voice heavy with dreams. Outside, the valleys revealed themselves once more. Rivers gleamed silver in the rising light. Forests dripped with dew and meadows open wide, dotted with clusters of chalets whose chimneys exhaled the first smoke of morning. A church bell rang faintly in one village, its sound carried across the valley with a clarity that made me shiver. It felt like a benediction, a final blessing from the mountains before we left them behind. The train crossed another bridge, and below lay a lake as still as glass. Its surface reflected the peaks and the sky so perfectly that it seemed the earth had doubled itself, one world resting on top of another. The sight took my breath away. I pressed my hands against the window, leaving a faint print, as if I could somehow hold the image steady, make it last longer. The water sparkled, and I thought of all the reflections I had carried: Rome's fountains, Paris's Seine, now this alpine mirror. Each one had shown me something different, not just about the world, but about myself. The passengers grew livelier as the light strengthened. A man further down the carriage struck up a quiet conversation with his neighbor, their voices rising and falling like the rhythm of the train. The couple unpacked bread and cheese from their bag, sharing it between them, offering a piece to the child behind me, who accepted with wide eyes and a shy smile. For a moment, the carriage felt less like a vessel of strangers and more like a small community, bound by the road we shared. I thought of how travel had carried me through so many forms of belonging: the chaotic embrace of Rome, the patient whispers of Paris, the profound silence of the Alps. And now, as we approached the edge of the mountains, I could feel another rhythm waiting. Not silence, not stillness, but echo. Germany was ahead, and with its stations alive at midnight, platforms humming with footsteps and the fleeting touch of lives intersecting for only moments. As the train dipped into another tunnel, I felt a pang of sadness. I didn't want to leave the mountains behind. They had stripped me bare, taken the noise from my chest, returned me to stillness. But perhaps that was their gift, not to keep me, but to prepare me. When we emerged back into daylight, the peaks were already farther away, their crowns fading into the horizon, their silence lingering only in my memory. I smiled faintly, resting my head against the glass. The sun rose fully, flooding the valleys with light, and I whispered a quiet thank you to the mountains, to the journey, and to the pause they had given me. By mid-morning, the train felt fully awake. The hush of dawn had lifted, replaced by the murmur of voices, the shuffle of bags being rearranged, the clink of cups and cutlery from the dining car. The lamps inside the carriage had been dimmed, leaving the sunlight to pour freely through the wide windows. It was a softer light now, golden and forgiving, spreading warmth across tired faces and catching on the glass until even our reflections seemed brighter, less weary. The couple across from me had unpacked their breakfast. Thick slices of bread, wedges of cheese, apples that gleamed with dew. They shared everything between them, laughing when crumbs scattered across their laps. The man with the newspaper had resumed his ritual, but this time his eyes left the pages more often, drawn outside to the shifting world. The child, more awake than ever, pointed at everything with breathless excitement. Cows grazing in pastures, bridges spanning impossible heights, clusters of chalets tucked against hillsides. His mother followed his finger with patience, her voice gentle as she answered his endless warum, meaning why? Each question seemed to build a bridge between them and the mountains outside, a private dialogue of wonder. I rose briefly and walked to the dining car. It was busier now, full of passengers taking coffee, tea, or pastries. The air smelled of butter, sugar, and something faintly savory, perhaps ham warming in sandwiches. A group of students sat at a table, their conversation loud and animated, hands flying as they gestured. An older couple sat quietly opposite each other, their silence companionable, their eyes fixed out the window as if in prayer. I ordered another coffee, stronger this time, and carried it back carefully, watching the dark liquid ripple with every sway of the train. Back in my seat, I sipped slowly, letting the warmth spread through me. I listened without intruding, fragments of stories caught between stations. A woman traveling to Zurich after visiting her daughter in Milan. A man describing his years working on construction in Austria. His accent thick, but his eyes kind. Another passenger, a student from Vienna, spoke about his dreams of becoming a painter, how he wanted to capture the exact way the morning light hit the peaks. Their words wove together into something more than conversation. They became proof that travel binds strangers, that for a few hours, lives overlapped like threads in a fabric none of us could see fully. Outside, the scenery remained inexhaustible. The train passed through valleys where rivers gleamed like liquid glass, then climbed ridges where the forest thinned into meadows blooming with wildflowers. Waterfalls tumbled down sheer cliffs, their spray catching the sun in arcs of rainbow. Sometimes the peaks loomed so close, I felt I could reach out and touch them. Other times, they faded into the distance, softened by haze. reminding me how vast the world could feel when you couldn't see its edges. At one curve, the tracks carried us across a viaduct, suspended dizzyingly high. I leaned close to the glass, my stomach tightening as I looked down at the gorge below. A river white and wild, tearing itself against rocks, its roar audible even through the sealed windows. Gasps filled the carriage, followed by laughter as passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks. Even the man with a newspaper chuckled softly, folding it away for good this time. For a moment, the entire train was united in awe, strangers sharing a heartbeat of wonder before retreating again into themselves. I thought then of how travel was less about places than about these shared instants. A gasp, a laugh, a question whispered into the air. Rome demanded my voice, Paris asked me to linger, the Alps so far had required my silence. But the train, this community of strangers, had given me something else, a reminder that even when we journey alone, we are never truly solitary. As the train carried us further north, the peaks began to soften. They were still immense, still awe-inspiring, but their edges blurred as valleys grew wider, as villages appeared more often, as the human presence reclaimed more of the land. I felt both gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude for the stillness the Alps had pressed into me, sorrow because I knew soon they would be behind me, existing only in memory. I set down my cup, closed my eyes for a moment, and simply breathed. The train hummed steadily, the passengers murmured around me, and outside the mountains still stretched on, refusing to let go too quickly. It was enough, more than enough. By afternoon, the train had begun to glide more gently, as though it too knew that the highest peaks were behind us. The world outside was still carved by mountains, but they no longer pressed so close, no longer towered like guardians at every turn. Valleys stretched wider now, rivers meandered more lazily, and towns appeared more often, their clusters of rooftops spreading like quilts across the land. The Alps were still with me, yes, but they were loosening their hold, fading into silhouettes on the horizon. The shift was subtle at first. A road cutting across a hillside, the steady pattern of fields divided by fences, more frequent clusters of homes with their gardens neat and orderly. The air itself seemed lighter somehow, less bracing, as if civilization had reclaimed this stretch of land. I pressed my palm against the window, reluctant to admit it. The wild immensity was giving way to human rhythm again. And yet I felt no disappointment. The mountains had done their work. They had hollowed out space in me, emptied me of noise, and now they were handing me forward, saying, "You are ready." Inside the carriage, passengers stirred differently too. The stillness of morning awe had been replaced by motion. Bags shifted down from racks, tickets checked again, jackets pulled tighter in anticipation of arrival. The young couple folded their blanket, their excitement spilling into plans for the evening. The man with the newspaper stood, stretched, and polished his glasses as though preparing to re-enter the ordinary world. The child had grown restless, bouncing in his seat, pressing his rabbit to the glass and declaring each town we passed to be ours, his mother laughing softly at his determination. I sipped the last of my coffee, lukewarm by now, and let the rhythm of the train steady me. Out the window, the landscape was dotted with steeples and clock towers, their bells ringing faintly across valleys. Smoke curled from chimneys, drifting lazily into the pale blue sky. I imagined kitchens full of bread and soup, children spilling through doors after school, families gathering at tables that had stood in the same spot for generations. The sight filled me with an ache both sweet and heavy, the longing for rootedness, the gratitude for movement. As the train curved along another ridge, I glimpsed a larger town below. Streets lit by amber lamps stretched outward like veins, cars crawling along them, their headlights glowing faintly even in daylight. A station roof gleamed in the distance, its iron ribs shining against the sky. The sight stirred something inside me. Anticipation. I knew Germany was close now, close enough that its rhythm was already humming beneath my feet. The Alps were releasing me into another chapter, one of echo instead of silence. I opened my notebook, but instead of filling the page with words, I wrote a single line across the top. The pause is ending. It was not sad, not heavy, just true. The pause had been necessary, a space carved for clarity. And now, as the tracks carried me steadily forward, I felt the first stirrings of readiness to be among voices again, to hear footsteps echo against iron, to feel the heartbeat of a station at midnight. The train plunged into a tunnel, and when it emerged, the peaks behind us were smaller, their snow caps glimmering faintly like fading crowns. Ahead, the land widened, stretched, invited. I leaned back in my seat, closed my notebook, and smiled. The Alps had been my breath. Germany would be my echo. And somewhere beyond, I could already sense another square, another night, another rhythm waiting. In Krakow. By evening, the train had left behind the last jagged walls of stone. The Alps no longer pressed against the windows with their sheer presence. Instead, they lingered in the distance like pale memories, their snowy crowns dissolving slowly into dusk. What unfolded before me was a gentler, more human landscape. Broad valleys spread wide, fields lined with fences, roads lit by headlights that threaded across the darkening earth like restless veins. The silence of the mountains had loosened its grip, and in its place came a steady, rising hum, the rhythm of human life. Inside the carriage, the light shifted with the hour. Lamps glowed warmly, honey-colored halos that blurred the edges of tired faces and gave the scene an intimacy that daytime never allowed. Passengers grew quieter, their movements more deliberate. The young couple, who had carried their excitement like a flame since morning, leaned over a map spread across their knees. Their fingers traced routes, their heads bent close, their laughter hushed but still alive, like an ember refusing to die. The man with the newspaper folded it carefully one final time, polished his glasses, and slipped them into his pocket. The ritual was complete, a quiet acknowledgement that the day had given him enough. Behind me, the child who had whispered, "Birge!" again and again, now sang softly to his rabbit. A tuneless melody repeated without end, a private charm to guard him against the unknown of arrival. The world beyond the glass shifted as constantly as the wheels beneath us. Villages gave way to towns, towns to cities. Amber street lights burned like fireflies scattered across the land, multiplying until they became rivers of light stretching into the horizon. Cars streamed along highways in twin lines of brightness, converging and parting like currents in a sea. Station roofs appeared more frequently now, vast arches of glass and iron glowing against the night, their platforms lit by tall lamps. Each one seemed busier, louder, more insistent than the last, as though preparing me for the station that would soon claim me, one that did not rest, even at midnight. At one stop, the train slowed long enough for me to study the scene. The platform was crowded with travelers wrapped in coats, their breath visible in clouds under the lamps. Families embraced, their voices loud with relief, their laughter spilling into the cold. Others parted, their hands lingering for one last squeeze before slipping reluctantly apart. Strangers hurried with rolling suitcases, their steps urgent, their gazes fixed forward. Above them all, the lamps cast long shadows that stretched across the tiles, pulling the moment thin and making it both fleeting and internal.
I pressed my hand against the window and felt the ache of envy for those who were arriving, for those who were greeted by arms waiting only for them. Yet I also felt belonging because all of us were tethered by the same thing: movement. We were fragments of a great rhythm that carried us all forward, no matter where we began or ended. When the whistle blew and the train pulled away again, I leaned back and let the glow of the city unfold. The lights thickened, no longer scattered, but dense, continuous. Towers rose above rooftops, office windows burned like grids of amber, and the roads below thrummed with life. I felt a sudden pang for the stillness of the Alps, for the deep breath they had carved inside me. Yet I realized something important. The silence I found in the mountains was not theirs alone to give. It lived inside me now, a space I could carry into the roar of cities. The Alps had not abandoned me. They had prepared me. I opened my notebook and let the pen move slowly across the page. The words came simple, steady. The pause is over. The echo begins. I underlined it once, set the pen down and let the sound of the wheels finish the thought. The horizon glowed brighter. Another large station appeared in the distance, its iron ribs rising above the city like a dark cathedral, lamps blazing against the sky. The train carved toward it, slowing with purpose. Around me, passengers gathered their bags, zipped jackets, stretched arms stiff from hours of stillness. The child's song ended as his mother whispered something in his ear, and he clutched his rabbit tighter, ready. The couple folded their map, kissed quickly, and smiled as though nothing could tire them. Even the man with the newspaper stood straighter, his face set with quiet determination. I felt my own breath deepen. The Alps were behind me now, their silence lingering only in memory. Ahead was a station alive with footsteps, voices, echoes, a place that belonged to no one and everyone, a threshold where stories crossed only for a moment before scattering again. The whistle sounded, sharp, decisive. The train slid forward, carrying me to the edge of stillness and into the heart of motion. I exhaled and whispered into the hum of the carriage, "I am ready."
The train slid into the station with a long metallic sigh, brakes screaming against the rails, and the sudden hush of motion ending. Midnight had settled fully by the time the doors opened, releasing a sharp breath of cold air that swept through the carriage and pulled me to my feet. I gathered my suitcase, my notebook, and stepped down onto the platform, the ground firm and echoing beneath me. The station rose around me like a cathedral of iron and glass, its vaulted ceiling arched impossibly high, ribs of steel crisscrossing against the faint shimmer of stars visible through panes of glass. Lamps blazed along the platforms, their light stretching into the shadows, casting every movement into elongated silhouettes. Announcements rattled through loudspeakers in German, clipped, efficient, commanding. Each word echoed, bouncing against the arches, folding into the hum of countless footsteps. The platform was alive despite the hour. Travelers hurried with bags trailing behind them, the wheels clicking against the tiles like a chorus of insects. A woman in a long coat embraced a man in uniform, their hugs so fierce that time itself seemed to pause. A group of students spilled out of another carriage, their laughter wild and defiant, echoing too loud in the vast hall. A child clutched her mother's hand, dragging her stuffed rabbit across the floor, its ears collecting dust as she yawned. Strangers brushed past one another without speaking, each bound for their own destination, each carried along by the same unrelenting rhythm. I walked slowly, unwilling to be swept too quickly into the current. My suitcase rattled behind me, my footsteps joining the echoes of thousands who had walked here before. The Alps had stripped me into silence. This place replaced that silence with resonance. It was not chaotic, not like Rome, but insistent, relentless.
a heartbeat magnified, repeated in every whistle, every bell, every hurried call of greeting or farewell. I stopped near the center of the hall, lifting my gaze to the clock suspended high above. Its hands pointed to 12 precisely. Midnight. Around me, the world did not sleep. Another whistle sounded, another train slid in, more voices, more stories, all intersecting briefly in this cavern of steel and light. And I understood, standing there, but the weight of my journey behind me, that stations at midnight are not endings. They are passages, thresholds, moments where the world breathes in and out at once. I sat briefly on a bench, my notebook in my lap, and watched as the stories unfolded in fragments. A man searched the crowd with eyes full of hope until he found her, and the smile that broke across his face was so raw it made my chest ache. Two women in heavy coats shared a cigarette just outside the doors, the laughter rising like sparks into the night. A boy with a guitar case leaned against a column, tapping his foot in rhythm to a song only he could hear. No one stayed long. Everyone moved, always moved. But for a heartbeat, all their lives touched the same floor, breathed the same air, echoed in the same chamber. I wrote one line in my notebook. This is the world's heartbeat, measured in echoes. The Alps had been my pause, a silence that stripped me bare. But here, in the echo of this station, I felt myself stitched back together, not with stillness, but with motion, with voices, footsteps, and the knowledge that life does not stop, not even for midnight. As I rose and pulled my suitcase toward the exit, I thought of where the rails would take me next, eastward, toward Krakow. I imagined lanterns glowing against ancient stone, voices rising from squares that had witnessed centuries, music spilling from doorways into the night. The thought tugged at me, insistent, alive, as though Krakow was already calling my name across the miles.